Hey guys, GHAZZY TV here with another Path of Exile build guide video. In this one, I'll be going through the Dark Pact Necromancer build guide, which has received some very extensive nerfs to the Immortal Ambition strategy. The build pretty much works in the same kind of state of functionality, however we are approaching it in a very different way. The written forum guide for this build is of course linked in the descriptions below, so do check that out. And before we dive into the gearing and skill tree of this guide, I do want to mention that the gameplay footage that you see is from the high budget version of this build, and the build works very well as a league starter, as well as in solo self-found, to handle the endgame bosses in a low budget state as well. The Dark Pact build is used in this build on our skeletons, so the playstyle requires us to cast the skeletons and then the Dark Pact, which will then chain between the skeletons, and each chain can hit the same target per chain, making the chain support gem the absolute best support gem for the build, besides Spell Echo. Since the skeletons are linked with Feeding Frenzy, they will consistently rush towards enemies with the Dark Pact explosions chaining on top of them. This offers a rather unique playstyle that is not for everyone, so proceed with caution if you're going to try this build. The defensive layers we're using in this build is that of a hybrid build, which means that we're using both life as well as energy shield to protect us, both of which are going to be leeched to help sustain the high effective life pool. We're also going to be using a high block chance with life recovery on block on top of the newly added skill Petrified Blood. This cuts our life in half, allowing us to use Pain Attunement Keystone as well as always overleeching our HP, which is a very handy mechanic when we're taking damage over time from ground effects or from enemies. Now a quick note on the defensive layer is that the leech comes from having a modifier on either a ring or an amulet providing chaos damage leeched as life. So prior to getting this available on your gear, you will not be having any leech. Towards the endgame, you're going to want a trigger craft on one of your weapons, allowing you to automatically trigger Desecrate, Bone Offering, as well as Convocation. Now this will, thanks to our Ascendancy nodes, provide us with a higher chance to block as well as recover life on block. This combined with a Rumi's Concoction unique flask fulfills the build's defensive layers to reliably survive the hardest endgame content available. Since Dark Pact deals a base chaos damage depending on how much life your skeletons have, the build focuses a lot on minion life, which significantly helps our Animate Guardian as well as our support Spectres survive even the highest endgame content reliably. This also means, thanks to the fact that Dark Pact itself has a minion tag, that scaling level of your spells as well as level of your minion skills is an optimal way to approach the modifiers to your weapons as well as your amulets. When it comes to the gearing of this character, it is very straightforward. Similar to other type of actual minion builds, this character is using level of minion skills as well as level of spell skills to scale the builds the best way, because of the fact that our Dark Pact has a spell tag as well as a minion tag. Now the first thing you want to think about is getting a trigger craft on one of your weapons. This allows us to have the automation of our Convocation as well as our Desecrate as well as our Bone Offering. And something that is important to note when it comes to this is the order of these is very crucial. I have Convocation at the top, and as you can see here in my action bar, you'll very clearly see that my first spell when I use an ability will put Convocation on a cooldown. So that uses Convocation, and now the ability will use the second skill. In this case it's going to be the Desecrate. So next time I use my Summon Skeletons, I will be then using Desecrate. As you can see here, it's put on cooldown. Next time I'll cast the ability, it will trigger the Bone Offering, and therefore every single ability will have a separate cooldown, and it's not an 8-second cooldown between each trigger. This allows us to use this in a very reliable way, as Bone Offering's base uptime has a 7.5 second duration, and the cooldown is 8 seconds. However, it will have an increased time based off 1 second per corpse consumed, and we are triggering 5 corpses, allowing us to have a 5-second extra timer onto this, allowing us to always run and have an uptime of Bone Offering that gives us extra block chance consistently. The other approach with this is the other weapon. In this case, we no longer need that extra plus trigger Sock of the Spells craft. In this case, we can then focus on having the extra modifiers to scale our damage. So in this one, we still want to focus on having plus level of spell skills and or level of minion skills, but we also want cast speed, critical strike chance for spells, as well as critical strike multiplier. If you can get all three, that would be optimal, but 2 of those modifiers would be a very good way to go with. I tend to focus on the critical strike chance for spells personally, and that's what I think you should do as well. But it's a matter of personal preference in how you want to scale the build. The gems used in this one is a multiple totems, spell totem, as well as a wither. This is allowing us to cast out 3 different totems that will cast wither on enemies to stack it up reliably. There are a few ways for the high budget version to bypass this through using withered on hit through a ritual of shadows, a notable that you can get from a glorious Vanity timeless jewel. But more of this is shown in the POB for the high budget version. You're still going to want to use a wither totem setup like this either way. The helmet is very straightforward. We're looking to get a warlord influence helmet eventually, and this is not too expensive and actually is very affordable for the lower budget approach. So this is the best way you can do it, and that is to get an item level 86 helmet, preferably of energy shield base, such as Hubris Circlet. In this, we want to have Dark Pact cast speed if you can get that enchant, and the focus is to get plus level of socket and minion gems, HP, as well as minion has increased life. This is very easily crafted through resonators or fossils, using bound and pristine fossils to get these modifiers very reliably. But it's not too crucial if you missed out on, for example, the minion life, if you want to look at a low budget approach to this. Now, the reason we want the level of socket and minion gems is, of course, because we're using skeletons in here. In my current build, I have summoned skeletons, and I'm using an Empower. I'm also using Minion Life, as well as Feeding Frenzy. What this does is that it increases the HP of our skeletons, which currently on my current build has almost 39,000 life. This increases the base damage dealt by my Dark Pact, which is an insane damage increase the more HP your skeletons have. And thanks to the Feeding Frenzy, as you see in the gameplay footage earlier, the skeletons will rush into the enemies as the Dark Pact is chaining on top of them. The boots we're using is going to be generic life boots with movement speed. For the higher budget version, you can look into Tailwind and Elusive, but that's for the higher budget approaches. But for low budget, you just want to focus on having movement speed and HP. And you normally want to have bases that gives you energy shields, such as the Sorcerer boots. Gloves, it's the same thing as we approach with the helmet. We're looking for minion life. Now on the gloves, for example, this is achieved through the Essences of Fear. And Essences of Fear allows us to roll minion life, and what I would recommend doing is using them on the gloves till you get a decent life roll or some resistances, and then benchcraft the HP yourself to get these type of gloves. There are 2 different bases I would recommend. One is fingerless silk gloves that I'm using, which increases spell damage. The other pair would be to use a pair of sorcerer gloves for, again, increased energy shield gain to cover our HP in a better way. The high budget belt is a Tauren Reclamation. For low budget, you can use something like a Darkness Enthroned with some proper jewels that increases your damage as well as maybe a minion life on them, which is very recommended. Or you can just use a Stygian Vice or any other rare belt with life and resistances to make it easier for you to gear the rest of your character. The rings is very straightforward. You want to make sure that you cap your elemental resistances. You want to get life and energy shield wherever you can. You also want to make sure you have enough attributes to cover the usage or the requirements for your gems. The other ring, in a high budget version, you could try to get an Assassin's Mark on hit kind of ring, which works very, very effectively. And this is something you can go for when it comes to the low budget as well, if it's not too expensive. However, it's not crucial. It's more for the high budget version. For low budget, you just want to focus on HP, energy shield, and resistances. The amulet is just going to be a bunch of HP, a lot of attributes, resistances. Chaos damage leached as life is an hunter influenced modifier. In this case, the modifier can actually be achieved through a delve drop ring. So if you can't find a proper amulet with this modifier, you can get such a modifier on one of your rings instead to alleviate that pressure. This type of modifier is the bread and butter of your defensive layers, allowing you to, during your mapping stages, have that insane amount of extra leech to your HP as well as leeching to your energy shield. The chest piece for a low budget approach would basically be in the form of HP and resistances and on an energy shield base. If you can get something like an influence base that gives you power charge on crit, that would be very attractive. You can also try to get something like this, which is a Woked Orb craft with a spell damage to, spell critical strike chance, as well as power charge on crit, allowing you to get that focus on the crit on a chest piece for the higher budget approaches. If there's an open prefix, you should always try to get the life as extra energy shield benchcraft on top of it. And that pretty much sums up the gearing. When it comes to low budget flask, for example, you want to have a life flask, a mana flask, a crit flask, a quicksilver flask, and a Rumi's concoction flask for that increased chances to block. Keep in mind that Mana Flask needs to be an enduring Mana Flask. This allows us to have the Mana Flask consistently roll. As you can see here in the bottom left, the Flask effect is still going even though I have maxed mana. This allows us to use this consistently, and the only problem you might encounter with this build is versus bosses where the bosses don't die before you run out of Flask charges. The solution to this is very simple. On Amulets, there is a craft. Let's see if I have it. There is a craft that allows you to have no mana cost when you're channeling, when you're focusing. Which basically makes it so that all your spells cost 0 mana when you focus. This is something you can achieve through unveiling crafts from betrayal encounters, which helps a lot. Normally this is quite annoying to get hands off, which is why I would strongly recommend being careful with your enduring mana flasks to use them and to not overuse the flask itself. I've never had any problems personally with this, but I have seen reports in my forum guides that some people have encountered issues with this, so I just want to mention it. You have to be careful with the way you're using the mana flask, where you're going to run into issues with it. Gems in the gloves, I'm using a Petrified Blood as well as a Discipline Aura. I also have a 2-link in here for Arcane Surge with Flame Dash. Keep in mind that you do not want to link Arcane Surge with the other abilities because it will increase the amount of mana reserved by these abilities. The boots, I'm using Animate Guardian together with Life Tap support, which is supposed to be with Meat Shield and Ray Spectre. Now the Meat Shield keeps your Spectres as well as your Animate Guardian close to you and safe. The Life Tap makes your charging Spectres cast their abilities more reliably than without the support gem. The support gems for the Dark Pact is a Chain, Spell Echo, Intensify, which is the 4 links that I would recommend starting with, and then it's Control Destructions, and then Void Manipulation. If you do go for high budget and you go for the Awaken gems, I would recommend focusing on the Awaken Chain, because extra chains is pretty much equal to 100% more damage, which is significant. The skill tree itself is very straightforward. Ascendancy nodes, we are definitely going to be rushing down to Unnatural Strength, because this gives us +2 level of all minion skills, which both affects our skeletons as well as our Dark Pact. The nodes before gives them increased damage, which also affects us because we're picking up Spiritual Aid. Then you want to have Mistress of Sacrifice because it scales our defensive stats, and then you want to go for Bone Barrier, mainly because it gives you some extra defense, but also because it increases the HP of our minions, which in hand gives us a ton of more damage. So the tree itself, you usually want to rush out on the side, pick up the life nodes, the minion nodes, go for Annihilation Crit is something you want to do with much later. But what you do when you're starting this build off early is to focus on the early stages that is non-crit modifiers, such as going for Arcane Expanse, Intensify, the nodes on the left going through Cruel Preparation, as well as Death Attunement and Corruption when you're leveling the build up, or you can follow the low-budget version of not using a Cluster Jewel. However, when it comes to the perks of going with upgraded versions of the skill tree, it's very straightforward. You get the access to a Cluster Jewel. If you go with the Unholy Grace in this position, which is done through having an Unwaveringly Evil, there's a couple of other mods that work for this. I would recommend utilizing PUB to verify which works. Allows us to spend 3 points in the tree into the clusters. We're making it a 5-point Cluster Jewel, giving you access to Blessed Rebirth, Hulking Corpses, which are the 2 best modifiers you can get on a Cluster Jewel, which significantly increases the HP of your minions, which is absolutely crazy. It is fair to say that Blessed Rebirth is mandatory for this build for the endgame stage. If you don't have access to a large Cluster Jewel, you still want to use a medium cluster with Blessed Rebirth, because it makes your minions that have been summoned recently not take damage. They will still be taking damage from your Dark Pact, but not from enemies. And this is the only way to reliably always make sure that you have skeletons out on the field that you can do damage with. So Blessed Rebirth is crucial for this specific approach. So again, if you don't have the Cluster Jewels or want to go for the high budget, you still want to have a medium Cluster Jewel. You smack that into this node, and you spec into the Blessed Rebirth. That's what you do. All of this information is in the written forum guide, linked in the descriptions below. When it comes to the update version of the Glorious Vanity, before we used Immortal Ambition because of the nerfs, we are now using the Glorious Vanity of Doriani. This allows us to get Corrupted Soul, which increases our maximal life as extra energy shield by 15%, but also makes 50% of non-chaos damage bypass our energy shield. This is why the HP can look a bit bouncy, but the build is very, very tanky, even if it looks a bit sketchy during the gameplay. It takes a while to get used to, but this is an insanely good defensive mechanism for the build and scales up our EHP. So if you look at my life right now, you can see that I'm sitting on 3,700 energy shield with this build. I have 3,738 life, which is then cut in half because of our Petrified Blood, allowing us to have a very smooth amount of HP. Because Petrified Blood blocks a certain amount of HP and then degens that HP to us, and we are overleeching. We are consistently overleeching the damage that is mitigated by Petrified Blood, so we're consistently taking less damage because of this. And we're always overleeching. And then the energy shield leech that we do no longer get from the life leech is now solved by picking up Light Eater, as well as Ethereal Feast, which increases the amount of energy shield leech we get from our damage. So we have both a source of life leech as well as a separate source of energy shield leech, allowing us to leech HP and energy shield to those pools that we've taken damage from all sources. So we're basically spreading out the damage we take on energy shield as well as HP, and we're always leeching those two sources. So it's a really cool mechanic to play with. It's been very interesting to play, and it's been a bit unique. So it's been very fun to do. Another note for high budget versions is to go for a natural instinct to get these nodes for free, as well as the aligned spirits. When you're looking at the high budget approach, keep in mind that once you start using Petrified Blood, you want to use Pain Attunement. And the other approach is that if you get higher level, you could spec into these nodes here to enable, and then like the level 4 in your gear to actually start using Zealotry as well. So it's a pretty cool approach if you want to push the build to min-max levels. This pretty much sums up the build in general. For a more detailed view, I would strongly recommend checking out the written forum version in the descriptions below. And if you'd like to help the channel out for more content, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more content, and leave a comment down below what you think of this build. Till next time, Exiles, stay safe and keep rocking.